The Coney Island Cyclone is one of the most famous and iconic roller coasters ever built, operating in Brooklyn, New York at Luna Park. Right up alongside the beach and stands at an impressive 75 feet tall, top speed 60 miles per hour, in just under 3,000 feet of track. But the real kicker is, it opened in 1927. When it opened, it cost no more than $175,000 to build. And at the time, it only cost 25 cents to ride. That's the modern day equivalent of about $5. Now, you're gonna have to pay about $10 to ride. And it was immediately a huge hit, one of the most impressive roller coasters ever built at the time. And the ride had a great run for about 40 years until the early 70s when the coaster was in need of a big overhaul. And the question came, should we tear it down or renovate it? There were huge efforts for Save the Cyclone because they were looking to use that land for further aquarium expansion. But instead, the park at the time, Astorland, leased the land, reopened the coaster, and here we are in 2023 as of when this video is being recorded, it's still open. And Luna Park does a great job keeping up with this thing. In 2016, another big overhaul was done, this time by GCI. They performed some excellent work to keep this thing running. As of today, it's a New York City landmark and is listed on the National Registry of Historic Places. So that just shows you how important this ride is. And the thing with old wooden roller coasters is, for many of them, the coolest thing about them is that they're old. But you actually ride it and you're like, you know, that's okay. Like, it's awesome that it's still here because of how historic it is, but the ride experience is fine. That is not the case with the Cyclone. This is a genuinely great ride. I first rode it in 2013. I got one lap on the coaster and enjoyed it. 10 years later, when I went back to Coney Island, I got many more laps in on it, and I had forgotten just how fun this was. Granted, there was that retracking in between, but I still don't think I fully appreciated the ride for what it is. This thing is full of personality and packed with airtime. I don't care if you've done one of the other Cyclone layouts on other rides around the world, because many parks have tried to mimic this ride. And some of them are better than others. I think about like Viper at Great America is pretty fun, but none of them come close to being as good as this thing is. So let's talk about what makes the Cyclone so awesome. Starting first with its appearance. I love the classic look of the station, the iconic sign out front. Everything about this ride is visually impressive. You can walk all the way around the structure. There's literally a parking lot right up against the coaster. Like, nothing about it is really dressed up. What you're looking at is what you get. They aren't trying to hide anything. They said, we're just gonna put a roller coaster on the street and you're gonna like it. When you enter the line, there's a bunch of history around the ride, talking about some of its notable moments. And then when you enter the station, there's not even air gates for this thing. You just stand off to the side on the platform, and when the train pulls up, you just walk in. You can't wait for a specific row, so when you scan your wristband or your ticket, it's first come, first serve. Whichever row you want, that's where you're sitting. The downside with that is that means if you're the last to enter the station, you're stuck with whatever row is remaining. It's either that or wait for the next train. And everything about the way this ride is run is just classic. They use a manual dispatch and braking system. If you look off to the side, there's just a dude who pulls a lever, and that's what allows the train to come to a stop and roll forward. These crews are great. I was just so impressed watching them work. I'm really glad that they haven't updated this thing with modern control systems. It keeps this thing feeling classic. Now, when you enter your train, this one's a bit more unconventional. First of all, it's 4 rows per car, which is very odd. Usually it's a 3-bench car, sometimes 2. But you have 4 rows here, and you can see up to 24 passengers per train. However, these rows are kinda tight. You can absolutely fit 2 passengers in there, but sometimes it is way more comfortable to just sit there by yourself. The plus side is that the seats are padded, so even though it can get kind of smushed in there, at least it's comfortable. I'd recommend, if you're gonna ride this thing, if you're an adult by yourself, take up the whole row for your own. Ideally, I think you could put 2 kids very comfortably next to each other, or an adult and a kid. The lap bar that comes down locks in the same place every time. It's basically a buzz bar, but this was probably done before buzz bars. It's also really padded. You're gonna roll out of the station, take a right turn, and start up your lift hill. And just looking straight up, this thing is hilarious because you can see how warped this lift hill is. This track is not straight at all. It's awesome. It's kind of a teaser of what's to come. You crest over, you'll get a great view of the beach out in front of you, and then you'll plunge down almost at a 60-degree angle, which is pretty steep for a ride that opened back in 1927. And for the first drop, I recommend sitting towards the back. You get some pretty insane ejector airtime. That's one of my favorite moments of this ride, but the Cyclone offers a lot more than just that. When you hit this first turn, you're immediately thrown to the side. This is the other thing the Cyclone does really well, is laterals. There's a lot of just unbanked turns on this thing. So when you combine that with the sharp ejector airtime, you just get the perfect formula for a fun ride. And it's turns like this that is the reason that I recommend you ride by yourself if you can. Because as you're taking these turns, you'll just get thrown to the side. So if you're sitting towards the left, you'll end up on the right seat. And then just throughout the layout, you'll get thrown back and forth. It's like you're bouncing from one seat to another because there's no divider down the center. It's just one booth. So the trains is really what helps make this ride so fun. If you ride with someone, however, be prepared that you might crush them on some of these turns. But that's also just part of the fun, right? But as much fun as the turns are, these drops coming off of the turns and into these hills are just so awesome. You slam down so hard, and that's why I really recommend sitting towards the back. The last row in particular has the most dramatic airtime, but it's also the roughest. There's like a bar below your cushion that your butt will continuously get slammed down upon, and you don't get that if you sit in the second to back row or the third to back row. It also doesn't help that if you're in the very last row, you're directly under some wheels, so that is going to be a bit rougher. The last row is definitely the roughest spot on the train, but some of those rough spots really send you up out of your seat, so it's a give and take. You get airtime, but you have to pay the price of a rougher ride. So depending on who you ask, many people will say that the last row is the best, but if you want a bit more comfortable of an experience, I'd say do second to back. But also, front row has its pros too. I know it's $10 to ride, but really, I can't recommend enough just getting multiple rides in on this thing. It is so much fun. The ride's almost 100 years old at this point. Nothing about it feels modern or precise. It's kind of a reminder that when this thing was built, it was done by hand without computers. And that's what makes it so enjoyable. I especially love moments like that last airtime hill when you're just so low to the ground. You just shoot up out of your seat. When you hit the brakes, you're like, man, that was awesome. I'm going again. I think about some of the world's oldest coasters, those that are still operating to this day. This has got to be one of the best. Like for me, it's this and Rutschebanen at Tivoli Gardens. That ride opened over 10 years prior to the Cyclone, and it's also an airtime machine. And it's just funny to me when you compare this to a ride like Dragon at Rye Playland. About an hour away from Coney Island, that's a 1929 coaster, nowhere near as good as the Cyclone. It's not even close. So when you consider the time frame that this ride was built in, and the fact that it's still operating this well all these years later, yeah, of course I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10. I think they did a phenomenal job. There's a reason that this ride inspired so many lookalikes all around the world, none of which, in my opinion, have come close to being as good as this one. So I highly recommend getting out to Coney Island, taking a ride on the Cyclone. I know people who have ridden hundreds of roller coasters that still consider this one of their favorite woodies of all time, and I totally see why. They just don't make them like they used to. It's the perfect amount of roughness, just enough to give it character, but still deliver on laterals and airtime. So let me know down in the comments below if you've ridden the Coney Island Cyclone, if you agree with the points that I brought up, if you think there's anything I missed, and stay tuned for more here at Coaster Studios, and I'll see you next time.